If you're new to us, we do the recap to get us kicked off, and we host that separately on YouTube. So if you happen to be watching that recap right now and you're interested in our full thoughts, discussions, and theories, we will link that video below. But without further ado, my good friend Blake, I apologize for making you do this again, but you want to kick us off on the recap?
Of course, it was only the greatest recap I've ever given. So yes, and I am excited to recap this. So this was a pretty awesome episode, and the episode starts out with where we left off, which is Chetney invisible in this cavern with this looming slug-like creature known as the Shade Mother, a lady emoth, and a multitude of shade creepers who are sort of skittering about in this large cavern. The Shade Mother herself can actually detach herself from her large slug carapace, I guess. And also, the party finds out that she can fly. So she has these
Yikes.
4 broomstone-esque devices sort of surgically implanted into her that allow her to fly and levitate. And essentially what happens at the start of this episode is the Shade Mother and Emoth are aware of Chetney's presence, and Chetney's a bit freaked out because the Shade Mother actually begins to speak to him in his mind, Lady Imogen style. And it's sort of like, where are you? And says pretty like stereotypical freaky cultish stuff like, come join us, be one with me, let me hug you, things like that. And Jenny's like, I'm good, no thanks. And she does ask, what's your name? And Jenny's like a bit freaked out at like giving away anything revealing. So he just thinks like balls. And she's like, you are called Balls? And he's like, yes, mighty Balls. So that's a nice little bit that happens for the next 2 hours of the episode. No, I'm just kidding. Just for a few minutes. Well, Jenny, skedaddles back to the group and is kind of like, yo, giant slug, lady emoth, what do we want to do? And they're kind of, sort of like tightening their gloves, like, all right, yeah, we're going to get in there and fight. And Ollie mentions that she has the beads for Lady Emoth and actually hands one over to Chetney in case one of the party members can use this to imprison her, and actually gives a little bit more clarity as to like what this little pearl does. Basically says if you touch it to a creature, it imprisons them in a not glass, but sort of glass-esque ball,
Yeah.
and that it's unbreakable. And for the next hour, the person's pretty much trapped in there. And Ollie basically says like it's used in prisons and things like that. So it's kind of like, yeah, remember guys, we're here for Lady Emoth. Like that's the goal. And I kind of took this as Matt kind of implying to the party, like, hey, this is going to be a pretty wild encounter. And so don't feel the need to kill the boss because it's going to get crazy. So party gets in and they actually start talking to the Shade Creeper the Shade Mother. And they're like, hey, so what's going on? What's going on down here? And the Shade Mother is basically just like, let me embrace you. Join me and my children. Again, pretty stereotypically crazy, evil creature stuff. And actually, Laudna decides to cast Silent Image and has a false Duggar crawling out of a hole on the opposite side. And the Shade Mother's kind of like, yeah, I don't really care about that. And she's even like, Matt, what about I have Duggar do this? And he's like, nope, doesn't care. She's like, dang it. And I think actually Laudna, as kind of like a joke, or Marisha kind of is like, all right, I just kind of slink back into the shadows then, do nothing. Once the party's kind of like exhausted, like they kind of realize like this isn't really going anywhere. Ashton turns to Gus and says, hey, light him up. And Gus is like, you got it. And begins his fireball, throws it at the massive slug and just obliterates a large portion of that and some shade creepers on the wall. And then combat starts. It's an awesome combat scene. There's a lot happening here. I'll just run through some of the higher notes that happen. Orem, being our classic courageous hero, immediately starts with goading attack and action surges with a second goading attack and actually slices underneath the Shade Mother, who is about 10 feet over the party, and slides under her and ends up on her backside so that he can do a flanking maneuver, and doesn't realize that she has a stinger, which very quickly pops him, and he gets injured pretty quickly, pretty badly.
Yeah.
not only that, but the Shade Mother also does like sort of like this AoE spore burst that hits Aurum and a few other people around. Meanwhile, Ashton and Imogen are fighting some Shade Creepers off to the side. Imogen spots this device in the sort of in the shadows of the lair. And if you remember from the previous episode, Matt had pointed there were a couple of like workshop workstations. Well, she spots this device, and it's very similar actually to one of the devices in the Nightmare King's lab. And there's a bit of an implication here that maybe the Nightmare King is the one who's created the Shade Mother, or who has implanted these broomstone devices into her. Besides that, on this device is this large purple gem that Imogen's like, yeah, I want that. And so yeah, goes, gets it, takes it, and that's her turn. She takes the purple gem. Fern does something really awesome. She casts Daylight, realizing that it's really dark in here, not realizing that Daylight is actually pretty effective against all of the baddies in this encounter. They're all seemingly blinded, in pain, like literally all of them, the Shade Mother, Lady Emoth, the Shade Creepers. And actually, I think they attack at a disadvantage on that next round. But so Daylight's awesome. It's really good. In fact, it's so effective that Lady Emoth has to go down from her ledge that she's hiding on and hide under this outcropping to sort of get away from the Daylight, which is the perfect time for Chetney in his invisible form to get over to her and take one of these beads and try to hit her with it. He rolls a natural 20. She has no chance of avoiding it. Hits her with it. She becomes this giant, trapped in this giant orange orb of like this crystal orb, and can't hear her. You can see her inside, just absolutely losing it. And the party just continues with combat. There's a couple other really cool things that happen. Remembering that their goal is to get Lady Emoth and get out. Fern uses her Stonky's ring, which is the ring that allows telekinesis, and that she got from Exandria Unlimited.
Yep.
And uses it to lift the orb and pull it towards her. It actually does it's not a flat terrain. This is a very cavernous area. It actually does get stuck or like wedged in some rocks, which Ashton has to sort of like beat on it to break it free. And what ends up happening is Fern ends up jumping on top of it in a very circus-esque way, begins like running on it to get it going like towards the tunnel. That happens. Meanwhile, Aurum takes his magical rope, and there is a sort of drill device that's in here, and decides to basically turn it on, and it gets aimed at the Shade Mother. He puts the rope in the gears of the drill and then ties the other side onto the stinger of the Shade Mother. And I can't think of a movie that does this, but I mean, it's pretty cool.
So cool.
The Shade Mother's tail, or like her stinger, gets drug into the gears of this grinding gears of this drill, and sort of gets immobilized as she gets like she doesn't get killed, but it hurts pretty badly, obviously. And that's really the party's sign to be like, okay, let's get the heck out of here. Let's get going. And the party basically makes their way out into the tunnels like, all right, we're going. We're getting out of here.
Less peace.
And that is actually a great time for Will to take over, because that's actually when they go to their break.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done, by the way. So, yeah, we go to break, we come back, and now basically we're met with this, like, escape section. So they're trying to roll the Lady Emoth orb back out the cavern to the elevator that they took to get down here. But like Blake mentioned, it's not this just wide open area. It's like a cave. So it's kind of difficult terrain, and it's easier said than done. And they're being chased by shade creepers the entire way. But Imogen uses her dancing lights to kind of illuminate, which helps them see, but also lets them see the horde of shade creatures coming their way. So they got to think of something quick. And if you'll recall, the elevator was packed on the way down, and that was before they had a giant Emoth orb that they had to figure out a way to get up as well. So while they're sitting there kind of figuring out a plan for how to get this how to get everyone up. They're getting attacked by the few shade creepers that are making their way toward them. And one actually crits Laudna and knocks her unconscious, or at least would knock her unconscious, but she uses this ability she has called the Strength of the Grave,
Yeah.
which is able, and she rolls just perfectly enough that she is able to stay
19
alive
exactly.
at
Yeah.
1 health. So that was pretty cool. But then the party finally decides, like, okay, Fern's like, what if I use my ring to like hold the orb beneath the cart? And they're like, well, what if it fails for some reason and it just drops into the abyss? So they're like, we can't do that. So ultimately they're like, okay, we're going to put the orb inside, and like the 3 smallest members that will also fit inside go inside. Then everyone else, you're going to stand on top of the cage. So Emoth Orb, FCG, Laudna, and Imogen all squeeze inside the cage, and everyone else, including Gus and Ollie, jump on top. But that's so many people on top that it's not really safe for them all up there. So Matt has them roll some checks as the elevator is making its way up, to see if they can stay. Ashton actually rolls a natural 1, but Fern is able to kind of grab him and make sure he doesn't fall. And so eventually they make it to the top with no other setbacks, and there's basically a collective sigh of relief as they all exit the elevator. And at some point during this elevator ride, I forgot to mention, they hear like this shriek from presumably the Shade Mother, and the legions of shade creepers that were following them end up turning back. So at some point, she deemed it wasn't worth it, or maybe she needed help because of the whole drill situation that Blake spoke about. But
It's
they
just your
did
classic
stop
drill
chasing
situation.
them. Yeah,
So,
everyday drill situation.
Yeah.
So they make it back to the top, and like I said, they kind of have a moment finally, and so they're kind of catching up, and the Green Seekers are, basically thanking the party for their help, and they say, we're going to take Lady Emoth to our employer, and we will clear y'all's name from suspicion of, the crazy things happening in Drusar. But before they part ways, Imogen does cast Detect Thoughts on Lady Emoth just to kind of get a pulse, and she basically just feels this like deep rage. But Imogen pushes further in and kind of finds a few things out about the Shade Mother, because she asks some questions. And basically what she finds out is, and this is like in Lady Emoth's thoughts, she says she's been down there for a long time, but only recently has evolved. And basically Imogen comes to believe that the person Lady Emoth used to be is no longer like there. Like that person is gone. The Green Seekers do say like, okay, well, again, thanks, but how do we get in touch with you if we need to? And they're like, just check Estros's manor, leave word there if we're not there. That'll be the best way, because we're heading out of town soon. And the Green Seekers do reveal that who they're working for, and that is Mistress Orlana Sasadri, and that they Sasadri, and that they have been working for her for about a month. And that she has like a disdain for Armand Tresci and does not trust him. And the party's like, okay, awesome. Well, are we official deputies now? And after a bit of back and forth, they do kind of concede, and they're like, fine, we'll get you some patches sent over to Estros's place. And but before they finally part, FCG does ask one more thing. He asks them about if they are familiar with any one-eyed creatures in the Orderian wilds. And Ollie thinks about it and says, there's many creatures there, but as far as one-eyed, there are some cyclops in the neighboring regions that sometimes will wander down, but other than that, she couldn't really think of anything. But she warns them that if they're going there, to stay on the trails because it's a very dangerous place. So then they part ways, and the party is... when FCG was asking about that, he kind of was going through kind of some of his glitches that he's exhibited in the past. He was saying like, is there any one-eyed creatures? So the party is like, hey, are you okay? And FCG says, they don't feel very great. And there's basically just this moment where everyone, especially Orem, is just encouraging FCG to take care of themselves. You're always doing such a good job taking care of everybody else. You need to make sure to take care of yourself sometimes too. So they're like, let's go rest. Let's go get a drink. And they decide to go unwind at the Soot and Swill, not the Sit and Spin, where they catch up with Pretty, who was the ogre that went on a date with the three ladies. And of course, he's excited to see them. He actually makes Imogen, Lotta, and Fern a special version of the meal that they're all served. And after they all eat and kind of have a few drinks, they decide to get their lodgings for the night. And Chetney gets a room for himself because he says, he might have some company later tonight. And but while they're still at dinner, before they head up, Fern does get out the sending stone to check on Dorian and just says, hey, just, seeing if you made it, making sure you're okay. And Matt, as Dorian, responds like, hey, it's been like 12 hours. It's the same day. Yeah, he's like, we're still on the ship. It's going to be about another week, but, we're doing good. So then as they're going up to their rooms, Chetney looks at Fern and is like, how long are we going to play this game? Like, how long are we going to pretend this isn't going to happen? And basically invites her to stay with him that night. And she says, you know what? If you howl at exactly 3 a.m., then I'll be there. So everyone goes to their rooms, and we kind of have I think they have like 3 rooms. Like Chetney has his own, and then the rest of the party is split amongst 2. Yeah. But it's a bit confusing because like different party members go to different people's rooms.
Constantly going back and forth.
Yeah, to have conversations. So without getting into the nuts and bolts of that, basically the conversations that happen are in Ashton and FCG, Imogen and Orem come speak to Ashton and FCG and basically continue on the conversation that they were having earlier, basically encouraging FCG that he needs to take care of himself. And it's basically kind of like an intervention. And, they just basically, let him know he's loved. And they really think they probably shouldn't press any further than that, just because FCG really needs to get some rest. So
I think he starts to either malfunction or something, but I think Imogen's to Orem is he's not ready.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she telepathically says that right to him.
Right.
So yeah, they just decide to leave it for there and let him get some rest. Ashton then goes and speaks to Laudna, and Laudna just had a really rough session. Like Marisha had a really rough session, which translates to Laudna. She was just rolling really poorly, and so Ashton goes and checks on Laudna, and he's like, I just feel like you had a rough day, so I wanted to make sure you were okay. And he was like, I found that, there's always a lesson to be learned from hard days. And sometimes that lesson is that there's no lesson. And she's like, I appreciate you coming here and helping me out. And he's like, is there anything I can do for you in return? And Ashton says, yeah, but I don't know what that is yet. And so they just kind of have a nice bonding moment. And he does reveal that, he's kind of terrified to leave Drusar. He's always felt kind of stuck here. And they just kind of connect. Laudna's like, I've never understood people that feel stuck in that way. I've always been able to just leave. She's like, people put all this value on this encroaching doom that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And Ashton's like, I appreciate the kind words, and I'm really thankful to have you and everyone else with me to leave Drusar, since they're about to go to the Heartmaw or whatever. And, just a nice little bonding moment.
Well, speaking of people being losing track of who's in rooms, I think Fern's actually in that room, and afterwards, that was a great conversation, guys. Because the 2 of them talk for 10 minutes.
Yeah, watching from the corner. So then the final little conversation a few of them have before sleep is they're just talking about dreams, because FCG reveals that he doesn't dream, and Ashton says that when he's sleeping, his head will sometimes spark, and everyone's just like, oh, that's cool. And Fern's like, I'm going to try to see if I can see that happening. And she's asked, well, hey, wait a second. What is this with you and Chetney? What's going on there? And she's just said, I just thought it would be funny. And she actually goes and knocks on his door, and he jolts awake and is like, what, is it time? And she's like, no, I was just, making sure you're still alive. And so Chetney actually just goes downstairs after that, in his underwear, and talks to the bartender and is like, can I get a wake up call and for 3 a.m.? And the bartender's basically like, no. And Chetney's like, well, what if I paid you a platinum? And he's like, oh, yeah. And he's like, well, I'm not going to. I just was wondering if you would. So he goes back upstairs with no wake-up call scheduled. So then everyone finally goes to sleep. But Imogen decides, you know what? I'm going to kind of take another look at that stone that she stole from the Shade Mother's machine. And she actually rolls an Arcana check and gets a nat 20. And she says or Matt says that there's something about it that like doesn't want to let her go. It wants to be near her. It wants to take her and turn her into something better. And actually, I misspoke. That was before everyone was asleep. She does that, but then she kind of like puts it away. And I think Laudna actually like puts a pillow over it or something. Then everyone goes to sleep. But Imogen can't help herself and wants to go inspect it again. So when everyone's asleep, she kind of goes and gets it. And Laura says she kind of just lets herself go to the stone. And she kind of feels herself being pulled toward it. And it has an odd familiarity to it. Which, like Blake mentioned, it's because of the things they saw in the Nightmare King's lab. And she begins to lose herself to the warmth of the gym and falls asleep.
Cradling it.
Yeah, and that's where the episode ends, but we do get one more little piece. We have a quick scene where Matt's like, so Travis, what happens at 3 a.m.? And Travis says, Chetney just definitely fell asleep. Like he wasn't awake at 3 a.m. And Ashley says, well, Fern was outside his door at 2:59 and, you know, a couple minutes passed and she just gave up and went to sleep. And that's where the session ended.
Good stuff. Don't forget, you can check out our deep dive. We're about to do it. It's in the description below if you're watching just the recap. Having said that, that is what happened on episode 16 of Critical Role.